And so I picked the cheery topic of despair. Thanks, Rick, and thanks to Leah for organizing tonight's lecture. I'll not carry on comfort, despair, feast on thee, not untwist, slack they may be, these last strands of a man in me, or most weary cry, I can no more. The repetition, the inverted syntax, the appositives, the dashes, the alliteration, everything in these opening lines of Gerard Manley Hopkins' a late 19th century sonnet, Carrion Comfort, underscores the agony that is the temptation to despair and the excruciating scream of the effort it is to fight back. I'll not carry in comfort, despair, feast on thee, not untwist, slack they may be, these last strands of a man in me, or most weary cry, I can no more. Poems like Hopkins put me in a bind tonight when I want to open up a literary text and analyze an experience as visceral and personal as the temptation to despair. How dare I get out literary terms like little white labels to label nerves live with pain? How dare we dissect scenes of despair, looking seemingly coolly at them, while clearly the characters in the scenes look out at their world through eyes wild with agony, frayed down to their last strands. I feel, therefore, the simultaneous effort to reply in two ways, riffing off Hopkins. I'll not carry on with comfort. Despair, I'll not fester thee. And, no, I'll care. I, uncomfortable, despair not follow me. That is, I don't want to fester the hearts and imaginations of those who daily struggle with the temptation to despair. I want to encourage health and healing. So soft pedaling around the topic of despair seems like, obviously to me, a kind of coherent logic. Don't drive a motorboat through a fragile coral reef. But I also want to engage this awful form of suffering to get at its nature and its costs, which means I'm also inclined toward making careful distinctions, sustained attention, and expanding the imaginative categories. Like, I don't know, a marine biologist with a razor-sharp blade taking samples to investigate reef blight. To preserve the tension between these two desires this evening, I want to appeal to and parse two early modern literary engagements with despair, to follow carefully the careful, awful, artful depictions of close encounters with despair in the hopes that we might better understand how the authors frame the enervating, despotic power of despair and what kinds of routes through it that they invent. The first text tonight chronologically is the Protestant poet courtier Edmund Spenser and his absurdly long knight in shining armor chivalric romance poem, The Fairy Queen. But rather than study tonight the scene where young Red Cross knight literally kills the dragon and gets the girl, yes, the plot line of Spenser's Fairy Queen is Joe Rigney's catchphrase, we will look at two conversations where it's all going so terribly wrong for both Red Cross knight and his poor Lady Una that they both need dramatic intervention. The latter text, though the one we will discuss first tonight, is a string of connected scenes from The Pilgrim's Progress, 1678, written by the nonconformist pastor John Bunyan, who actively adapted Spenser's material to grapple further with the pernicious and persistent temptation to despair. Tonight, my goals are threefold. My first is historical literary exposure. I want to highlight how pervasive of an issue the temptation to despair was in the early modern imagination, and simultaneously to show how seriously Christian thinkers took it and engaged with it. I'll argue tonight that Spenser and Bunyan agree not only on the deeply concerning persuasive powers of despairing rhetoric, both imagined as a dialogue, but both provocatively agree on the good of highlighting despair's interior logic and lingering over it in ways that feel foreign, even perverse to our modern sensibilities. Both present others as a critical help for enduring a season of despairing and for escaping from despair itself. And I'll offer these acute stories of distress tonight in order to offer a mimetic rather than a diagnostic encouragement. In other words, I don't plan to systematize the symptoms of despairing or offer a step-by-step regimen out of it, but I do want to explore two descriptive parallel models we might imitate. A note of caution in doing historical retrieval work. We should be hesitant to swap out the early modern description of melancholy and put in our modern clinical diagnosis of depression. You can't just take any old parts out of a Humvee engine and pop them in a Tesla and hop on the 35W. The most significant reason for this is the framework of understanding the human person has shifted. 17th and 18th century doctors, pastors, philosophers, and writers aren't working with the same chemically and neurologically based categories and causes that assess the physical, spiritual, emotional, and mental states. They're thinking primarily in terms of memory and habituation, bodily humors and bile, the scope of the will, and the impact of spiritual forces. But yes, like our modern psychologists and therapists, these early modern pastors, philosophers, and physics labor to understand how the human is framed. They debate with one another and test new theories against observation, while also relying heavily on ancient Greek physicians like Galen and biblical categories like sin, as they sought to account for the various complexities in the human being. Historical literary retrieval is a bit like cross-cultural study. There is much we all share, all being humans made in the image of God, but things shared in common should not eclipse the disciplined humility of listening for distinctions. Not only does such attentiveness honor the lives, thoughts, and historical context of others, but it also makes possible the opportunity of learning something new to us, generative frames for reference, and fresh governing assumptions. I also want to set expectations for my method today as well. Since I have chosen a literary text to frame our conversation tonight, I will be taking a descriptive rather than a diagnostic approach to understanding melancholy and despair. I won't be doing much systematizing. If you are interested in how the Venn diagram of bodily, mental, and soul care worked together before the Reformation and through it, I'd heartily recommend to you Matthew Lepine's The Logic of the Body for his excellent historical retrieval work, his assessment of key transitions, and his careful translation of historical categories to recommend alternative ways of understanding why we are the way that we are. Similarly, because I have no formal clinical or counseling training to my name, I have in no way designated this lecture as a group counseling session or even a list of best practices. Rather, ready with attentive literary categories, including the discipline of close reading, I'd like us to spend our time today familiarizing ourselves with this familiar, but yet distinct early modern world, and patiently listen to better understand how its thinkers understand themselves. Distinguished from the way that we use melancholy today to describe about a sadness or even a pensive mood like a Chopin nocturne, melancholy, melancholia, or a melancholic disposition in the early modern period described a habituated state, or that's what they mean by a humor, right, of acute sadness that was inclined to be mournfully introspective, associated with black bile in the body. Melancholy described a condition, something true over time, while the description despair applies to an end-of-the-road catastrophic event in a melancholic state. It is true, however, as late as the early 19th century that the two terms could be used synonymously, melancholy and despairing. When used as a present participle, despairing describes an ongoing state rather than a specific action. Melancholy can also describe an emotional or dispositional response to a specific event. Those vocationally involved in caring for others, think doctors, pastors, parents, were particularly attentive to the ways that melancholy could lead to despair and were vigilant against despair's worst possible end, what Shakespeare's Hamlet calls self-slaughter or suicide. The condition of melancholy and the slide from melancholy to despair doubled a sufficient number of English men and women over the 16th and 17th century, believers and unbelievers alike, to make the causes, manifestations, cures of melancholy the persistent concern across early modern writings. Perhaps the most famous example is in 1621. Robert Burton takes up the question from a medical, philosophical, religious, and social perspective in his Anatomy of Melancholy, and he returns to the question in the subsequent 5 revised editions he published during his lifetime. We can feel his desire for comprehensiveness in the 900 pages under the full title, The Anatomy of Melancholy, What It Is, with its kinds, causes, symptoms, prognostics, and several cures of it. In 3 main portions, there are several sections, members, and subsections, philosophically, medicinally, historically, opened and cut up. Notice that Burton suggests in his title that he will anatomize melancholy. He's going to cut it up and dissect it like a cadaver. And in the rather intense analogy that he builds into his title, he underscores not only his goal but also his approach, that he hopes to divide melancholy into its several sections and subsections, or analyzing and systematizing, in order to make sense of the persistent trouble. And Burton's study is not the only one, right? Burton relied on and referred repeatedly to Timothy Bright's Another competitive title. A treatise of melancholy, containing the causes thereof, the reasons of the strange effect it worketh on our minds and bodies, with physic, cure, spiritual consolation for such as have unto adjoined the afflicted conscience. Published 35 years earlier in 1586. A physician and a cleric, Bright organizes the same systematic way. As melancholy was of keen interest to particularly doctor pastors, it's a really popular early modern vocation combo, but probably outside of our vocational pathways here at Bethlehem. Sermons and devotional writings on melancholy and the possibility of despair give significant attention to the connection between melancholy and the conviction of sin, as in John Decalogue Dodd's sermon on Zechariah 12, when Dodd's instructing on the relationship between knowledge of sin and reliance on Christ takes up the voice of those afraid of becoming melancholic and driven to desperation by meditating too much on their sins. In the same vein, in his 1671 sermon on Christ's Sermon on the Mount, Thomas Watson identifies despair as one of the 9 hindrances to holy mourning. There's a tension there, alongside love of sin and the fear that mourning for our sins will make us melancholy. Because it required some deft distinction making, early modern doctor pastors give a lot of time to carefully distinguishing and cataloging differences between a melancholy that actually leads to godly sorrow, first to repentance and then to a further kind of devout sorrowing, but sorrow mingled with a relief and joy in Christ's atoning work, as opposed to the malady of melancholy that concentrates only ever on one's sins. But the pastoral attention to melancholy in the late Reformation England is not merely systematic, it's also descriptive. For example, in his June 8, 1627 Sermon 2 on 2 Peter 3:13, commemorating the life of his dear friend and patroness, Lady Danvers, also known as George Herbert's mother Magdalene, John Donne offers metaphors for 2 kinds of melancholic experiences. He presents one kind of melancholy as a persistent lying under the water of melancholy, as opposed to those who experience a high tide of it or confront it acutely but episodically. And John Donne's pastoral treatment of melancholy is matched by his poetic investment in it. The first of his holy sonnets from 1633 describe his 2 terrors, despair behind and death before. He meditates on the relationship between deep bitterness in others breeding careless despair in me. His poems ponder how to discern the genuine sigh of despair from one of affect. He imagines fixed despair's culpability in fatalities in human history alongside war, age, ague, and tyranny. Alongside Donne's sonnets, despairing in melancholy's footprints traipse across to his literary contemporaries who bookend him, Edmund Spenser and John Bunyan. One of the pedagogical tenets of 19th century educator John Milton Gregory's 7 Laws of Teaching is to move from the known thing to the unknown thing when teaching. So we'll take up the literary treatment of despairing, and more poignantly of despair, by starting with Bunyan's more familiar linked scenes of despairing, what I would identify as Christians' sustained experience of melancholy over a lifetime, and work our way backwards to Spenser's equally poignant but episodic scenes of despair. Join me as we work chronologically backward from Pilgrim's Progress, 1678, to The Faerie Queen, Book 1, 1590, from the adaptation to the source. As we look at this cache of scenes, how does the nature of despair clarify these paired descriptions? Thanks to the powerful illustrated edition of Pilgrim's Progress, like Memoria Press's 1985, The Dangerous Journey, those of us familiar with Bunyan's traveling pilgrim Christian know that Christian's troubles on his journey begin almost instantly with his fall into the slough of despond. We learn from Christian that he falls because fear followed him so hard, and the character Help, who gives Christian a hand out of the slough, explains to the story's narrator-dreamer that this particular sinkhole is the, quote, scum and filth that attend the conviction of sin that continually run. Notice that Bunyan distinguishes conviction from sin from the slough itself. And because Pliable falls into that slough with Christian, although he does get out more quickly, we might be tempted to assume that the way to the celestial city includes a tumble into this bog of despond. But the text is clear. While conviction of sin is something that characterizes the journey of true pilgrims, a dunk in the mud is not. Only some fall in. When Christian compares notes with the pilgrim Faithful, who he meets after losing his burden at the foot of the cross, he finds out that Faithful never falls into the slough. Christian also learns that Faithful's experience in the valley of the shadow of death is completely different than his own. Oh, in the valley, Christian experiences doleful voices and rushings to and fro that paralyze him, and fiendish voices that confuse him so much he begins to believe that their voice are his own voice, and he, quote, no longer knows his own voice. We're told by the dreamer narrator that had the sun not begun to rise in the second half of the valley, quote, if Christian had 1,000 souls, they had in reason been cast away because of the snares and the traps and the gins and the nets and the pits and the pitfalls and the deep holes and the shelvings. That polysyndeton and. That past contrary to fact construction tells us that if the sun had not risen, we would have lost Christian to what appears to be despair over his confused perception of the blasphemies he hears in his ear that he thinks originate in his heart, even though they aren't his at all. And we're told this very thought that these are blasphemies from his heart, even though he's just hearing them, put him to more distress than anything he had met with before. But it's not so for his friend Faithful. Faithful, we're told, get this, had sunshine all the way through the valley of the shadow of death. It's a direct quote. As we compare Christian's second despairing scene with Faithful's own journey, we're beginning to notice a pattern. Faithful doesn't struggle with the same repeated, sustained trials that Christian does, even though they are walking the same way. Stanley Fish describes the heterogeneity of the way, or what we could call its idiosyncrasy, its uniqueness to each pilgrim that they encounter themselves again and again and again along the way. To be sure, Faithful has troubles of his own that I'd love to talk about in the Q&A, but by the middle of the book, we clearly recognize that melancholy is going to dog Christian for the rest of his life. We should not be surprised, therefore, when Christian experiences the actual river of death at the end of the book, much like the mental space of the valley of the shadow of death and the physical space of the slough of despond. Christian began to sink. Oh yes, sink. It's an inclusio, right? Christian sinking here pairs with his sinking in the slough of despond at the beginning of the book. And, a long quote, a great darkness and horror fell upon Christian, so he could not see before him. Also here, in great measure, he lost his senses, and he could neither remember nor talk orderly of any of the sweet refreshments he met on the way of his pilgrimage. But all the words he spoke still tended to discover that he had a horror of mind, his hearty fears that he should die in that river and never obtain entrance to the gate. Despair is palpable in death for Christian, and Christian's friend Hopeful has much ado to keep brother Christian's head above the water, and much ado to remind him of the text of promise. My brother, he says, you have quite forgot the text of Psalm 73, where the troubles and distress are not the sign that God has forsaken the psalmist, but are sent as a trial. Well, what kind of trial? The trial, Hopeful says, of whether you call to mind that which you have heretofore received of his goodness and live upon him in your distress. But wait. It doesn't seem very fair. Notice how mind and speech-oriented Christian's despairing is. Hopeful can tell Christian is despairing both because the man is physically sinking in the river and because his speech discloses a mental state. This poses a dilemma for the melancholic, right? The Christian's mind is addled in his distress. How is this mental trial supposed to showcase Christian's faith, one that needs him to call to mind God's goodness when his mind can neither remember nor orderly talk? How can we solve this problem? Well, we could keep reading for clues. Christian goes into a muse for a while. We might call this a daze. So Hopeful adds one more encouragement for good measure. Be of good cheer, he calls out to Christian. Jesus Christ makes you whole. And suddenly Christian breaks out of the swoon and starts reciting Isaiah 43:2. When thou passest through the waters, I will be with you. What do we make of this sudden change? It's all rather abrupt. Well, it seems that Bunyan doubles down on what Hopeful had said. Yes, Christian must live upon Christ in his distress by calling to mind the goodness of God. But Bunyan is also so tender to showcase how the mind that cannot remember or talk orderly of the goodness that, quote, he has heretofore received, might rely on the memory of another, just as Christian's head is physically held up above the waters by Hopeful in the allegory. It takes multiple encouragements from Hopeful to Christian to help him out. I count 4 in the scene alone. And either because the layers and layers of promises accumulate to be of substantive help, or because by grace, at least one of those promises get through to Christian. In either case, Christian remembers the memory of his friend as his own. Hopeful's remembering stabilizes Christian's memory until he can remember for himself and, quote, take courage. This is the happy inverse of the evil voices which Christian heard in the valley, which he couldn't distinguish from his own. If Christian can confuse tempting words, extrinsic words, those which are outside of him as his very own, it's also true that the words of another, true and good words, can help him ground his own memory and his own voice. We've now walked through 3 scenes of Christian's acute melancholy, none of which, though, is the most famous nor the most explicit in the text. For that climactic scene of Christian's despair, we need to go to, that's right, Doubting Castle, where Christian gets captured by a giant literally named Despair. Allegories are allowed to be a little on the nose. But to understand the potency of the despair in that scene and the near miss with death in Doubting Castle, it's not enough for us to merely have cataloged the other scenes of Christian's despond, which we've done. Bunyan gives us one more crucial literary double in Pilgrim's Progress that pairs with the scene in Doubting Castle, a double he introduced earlier in the story at the house of the interpreter. The interpreter's house is a wild place because of all the double-layered allegory. A double-double, anyone? We are inside an allegorical dream of a journey, and on that journey, Christian goes to the interpreter's house where he tours a number of rooms, acting out, or really living mini-scenes on repeat, most of which the interpreter methodically and carefully interprets for Christian. But the scene that is explicitly left uninterpreted is, quote, the very dark room where the man sat in the iron cage. We read, "Now, the man, to look on, seemed very sad. He sat with his eyes looking down to the ground, his hands folded together, and he sighed as if he would break his heart." And Christian says, "What means this?" At which the interpreter bid him talk to the man. And the man tells us, and Christian, "I am the man of despair. I'm shut up in it, as in this iron cage. I cannot get out. Oh, I cannot." And after hearing how the man has lived his life, Christian again turns his attention to the interpreter to ask for clarification. But is there no hope for a man such as this? And the interpreter again deflects from doing his interpreting job and says, "Ask him." The man in the iron cage insists that there is no hope for him. So Christian raises the possibility of repentance. "But canst thou not repent and turn?" And the man insists, "God has denied me repentance. His word gives me no encouragement to believe. Yea, he himself has shut me up in the iron cage, nor can any man in this world let me out." Now, at this point, we expect the interpreter to step in and set the record straight, agreeing with Christian that the possibility yet exists for the man in the iron cage to repent. While there is life, there is hope, right? And that one man is indeed sufficient to set him free. But the interpreter doesn't clarify. He explicitly doesn't interpret. He simply concludes, "Let this man's misery be remembered by thee, and an everlasting caution to thee." To which Christian replies, "Well, this is fearful. God help me to watch and be sober, and to pray that I may shun the causes of this man's misery." And they go on their way to the next room. Bunyan leaves so much underclarified here. If this were college-aged me in class, I would have left the room so frustrated. I leave this scene so frustrated. First with the interpreter. "You failure of an interpreter! Don't you understand? This is the very scene, more than any other, that Christian needs help understanding. He struggles with melancholy, man. Don't leave him in the place where he's going to take the man in the iron cage's reading as the accurate one. Good grief! Banish the confusion. Clarify. Do your job." And then I get frustrated with Bunyan. What are you doing? You, more than anyone else, you who explain in your own 1666 autobiography how much you struggled with sinking into despair. How could you, Mr. Author, let this scene go uninterpreted, not just for Christian, but for your readers who have lived as you live and suffer as you suffer? Tell them that the man in the iron cage is wrong. The only help we get from Bunyan is his margin notes. More on those in the Q&A if you'd like, they're fabulous. But all they offer is an obvious, if tragic, summary note. Despair is like an iron cage. Of all the things we did not need footnoted in the scene, like cues the literary eye roll, right? Bunyan makes the interpreter silent on a key despair text, and therefore leaves the possibility for misreading live on the table. For now. So we just have to keep reading. Where do we find the interpretive keys to this scene that so resists easy ciphering? What's going to help us determine if you can actually sin yourself out of God's mercy in a way that repentance is no longer on the table, such that perpetual and final despair is actually justified? Who's going to help us? Christian. Christian's going to do it. Wonder of wonders, it's Christian, the pilgrim who suffers so much under the relentless temptation to despair through the story, who we find out actually understands the man in the iron cage's scene, perhaps not unlike the way Frodo understands Gollum. Christian first interprets the man in the iron cage for us and his hosts at the Palace Beautiful, another 12 pages later, and then he lives for us an alternative ending to the story in the very dark room where he is the captive of the giant despair, and he offers us a man of despairing, but not a man, thanks be to God, despaired. At the Palace Beautiful, hostess Miss Discretion and her companions Charity, Piety, Prudence, I don't know where this book was when I was naming my 4 daughters, ask Christian about his journey, including specifically the things he saw at the house of the interpreter. And Christian explains, I saw a man who had sinned himself quite out of the hopes of God's mercy. Well, that's interesting. What did Christian just do in that simple sentence? With a very small addition of a prepositional phrase, he relays the malady of the man in the iron cage, but also interprets what the man's real problem is. It wasn't that the possibility of forgiveness was divinely denied to him. No, Christian suggests that the man had sinned himself out of the hope of God's mercy. In other words, Christian clarifies that the man's sin keeps him from hoping in God's mercy. It distracts him, it blinds him. So maybe Bunyan's margin notes are more helpful than we first thought. Despair is like an iron cage, but it actually isn't, and it isn't an actual iron cage. The sensation of hopelessness that the man in the iron cage feels is a real sensation to him, but the conclusion that he must needs despair is not true to reality. While there is life, hope yet remains. Now, finally, to Christian's own living counterparable, his run-in with that big old giant despair. Perhaps you remember Christian urging Hopeful to take the bypath meadow, and then the two fall asleep trespassing on the giant's lands. The giant throws them into the dungeon, and after beating them, tells them that since they were never likely to come out of this place, their own way would be forthwith to make an end of themselves with either knife, halter, or poison. Christian inclines toward dying out of hand rather than living thus. It's a grim moment in the allegory, because despair fully realized would be suicide, what despair is, losing of all hope and therefore the will to live. So, Hopeful buys some time by counter-persuading Christian, like Shakespeare's Hamlet warning that the canon of the Almighty is set against self-slaughter, and he suggests that some possible good might happen yet. Hopeful moderates Christian to wait. Then, when the giant visits again, he finds Christian and Hopeful alive. And truly alive was all. It's really grim. And after threatening them again, Christian falls into a swoon. Remember the river of death, and Christian then again seems to be for taking their life. So this time, Hopeful remembers for Christian all the times that Christian has, quote, played the man, an important Reformation phrase referring to Latimer and Ridley. Before Apollyon, in the valley, in the cage at Vanity Fair, and then they pray together from about midnight on Saturday until break of day. And I don't think it's an insignificant detail that the Lord's Day has dawned, and the two of them are gathered in the Lord's name in this little prison. When, like the river of death, Christian, quote, half amazed, broke out in a passionate speech, remembering that he actually has a key on him called promise that opens any door. Like the scene in the river of death, we would do well to ask what moved Christian to remember his magic key just now, just hours before the giant, at the counsel of his wife, comes to search their nasty little pocketses. Why now? Because of the Lord's mercy, yes. Just as Hopeful said God might act on their behalf. But God's mercy has come through means. Hopeful being the most significant one in the scene. Hopeful's counter-persuasion, Hopeful's memory, Hopeful's persistent hoping in God that holds space for Christian to come out of his days and into his own memory. What does the man in the iron cage not have? Hope! What's locked in the iron cage with Christian? Hopeful! You think this name is an accident? We think of hope as a future-oriented virtue. But for Bunyan, its usefulness in the future is predicated on its role as an aid to memory. It helps us hold on to the past rightly into the future. It's also worth noting that just because Christian remembers the key promise this time doesn't mean that he doesn't fall into despond again. He does. Despair dogs him all the way home. Crossing the river of death is the last struggle in the journey, and we've already gurgled and sloshed with Christian and Hopeful through that. Bunyan's vivid giant despair sequence at Doubting Castle does not originate with him. It's borrowed, and I'll argue all the more potent for its fresh arrangement, ask the juniors. Bunyan creates his giant despair by joining vignettes and details from 3 separate books, books 7, 8, and 9, from Edmund Spenser's chivalric romance, The Faerie Queene. In this kill the dragon, get the girl story, the knight in less than shining armor named Red Cross has gotten himself into progressively worse trouble over the course of the poem. After being deceived by the wicked enchanter, he leaves the girl he's supposed to chaperone and champion, falls for a duplicitous evil hag dressed up, and now just barely escapes from Lucifera. Yes, her name is supposed to sound like Lucifer, and her deadly house of pride. Vulnerable after a stay in the House of Pride, made weak by drinking enchanted waters, and distracted by a dalliance in the grass with that fancy hag lady named Duessa, bad news, that lady, Red Cross Knight is taken captive by a hideous giant, horrible and huge. The giant's name is, not Despair, but rather Orgoglio. For those of you with a Romance background language, you can tell who Orgoglio's double is. Yes, like the Spanish word orgullo, the Italian word orgoglio means pride. And so Orgoglio is the double of Lucifera and her house of pride. Red Cross Knight has traded one fall into pride for another fall into pride. Out of the frying pan, into the fire, so they say. Can we tell what Red Cross Knight's besetting sin is? But rather than just give us a knight who struggles with one sin, or one temptation, namely pride, Spenser, 2 generations before Bunyan, links temptations, namely the less obvious connection between pride and despair. I tend to put those together. Red Cross Knight's captivity in the House of Pride weakens him substantially. When he's finally rescued by King Arthur, who kills the giant, smashes in the doors of the prison, Red Cross Knight is emaciated and more vulnerable than he has yet been, and his rightfully Lady Una wants him to take some time to recover. But at this moment, as is always in a chivalric romance, something dramatic happens, and the wild-eyed Sir Trevison comes galloping in to announce that his friend and companion Sir Terwin has just killed himself in the cave of the nasty, ragged-haired villain named, Despair. You guessed it, Despair. So, Red Cross Knight announced that he will go and fight the evil Despair and right the wrongful death of Sir Terwin. But Sir Trevison warns him very sternly that he too might be tempted to kill himself if he should hear Despair's words. But God, you never hear his charmed speeches. Red Cross Knight rolls his eyes that idle speech could spoil the, quote, castle of health, which is ironic considering how emaciated he is, but. To which the troubled Trevison hotly explains, Despair's subtle tongue, like dripping honey, melteth into the heart, searches every vein. Oh, sir, do not desire to try his guileful train. Well, you guessed it. Red Cross Knight goes anyway. And yes, it goes very badly. Let's just say that Spenser's introduction to Despair's cave and his lingering over every ghastly detail, including the still warm body of Terwin, is powerful foreshadowing. I'll spare you the Halloween-like details, but worse than the spectacle of the doleful drear are the words of Despair. For 10 long Spenserian stanzas, each of which are 9 lines, Spenser gives Despair the microphone, so to speak. And for 90 miserable lines of poetry, Despair applauds suicide as freedom from suffering. He rebukes Red Cross Knight for grieving at Sir Terwin's good. He argues that because all things die, mortality, the length of life does not matter. He warns that Red Cross Knight's longer life means more time to sin, and he reminds Red Cross Knight how sucky life is, with fear, sickness, age, loss, labor, sorrow, strife, and pain. And then, most painfully, Despair reminds Red Cross Knight of everything he's done wrong throughout the preceding 9 cantos. Quoting back his sins to him as half-truths, Despair ends his platform speech. Is it not his law, let every sinner die? Die shall all flesh? Why then must needs be done? Is not better to do willingly than linger till the glass be all outrun? Death is the end of woes. Die soon, O fairy son. Die soon, O fairy son. Haunting words indeed. And psst, like a sword stab, perhaps that's too on the point in a conversation about potential stabbings, Spenser tells us that Despair's speech makes a secret breach into his conscience. And then, as though charmed with enchanted rhymes, Red Cross Knight loses his manly powers. Despair won't relent. He provokes Red Cross's already vivid imagination by suggesting, like Bunyan's giant, how to take his life. His catalog's just a lot longer than Bunyan's. Tension is at an all-time high in the story. Red Cross's resistance isn't going to hold out, physically or rhetorically, and King Arthur is already gone. This time, it's Lady Una. who steps in and snatches the knife out of Red Cross's hands and counters Despair's deceptive arguments with arguments of her own. We can feel the passion in her own voice, her fear, her agony, more than shame or condemnation in her alliterative Fs. Fie, fie, faint-hearted knight, and come away, frail, feeble, fleshly wight. Una reminds Red Cross Knight of his job to do. Remember the dragon he's supposed to kill? And the greater grace than all sin. And like that marsh wiggle puddle glum in the cave of the Green Lady, Una wins the day by her sound counsel and snatching that darn knife. Together, Una and Red Cross Knight flee from the sick home of Despair, who, as they're trying to leave, tries to kill himself, even though Despair cannot die. Something apparently he does regularly, the stanza tells us. Oofta. You thought the illustrated dangerous journey was the stuff of nightmares, and I gave you the most Cliff Notes version. What boggles my mind about Spenser's description of despair is the amount of time and space he gives to what he had already announced in the voice of Sir Trevisan to be the most dangerous voice. Don't listen to him, we are emphatically told. And then Spenser lets him speak for 90 lines of sophisticated, artful rhetoric. What in the blazes? Is this just an example of an author perversely tempting the reader? Isn't why we have trigger warnings on modern books, so we don't have to walk through Despair's rhetoric point by point, so that we don't encounter what is so dangerous to encounter? Do you see what a terrible bind, a second bind, this puts me in as a lecturer tonight, or in a class at Bethlehem College and Seminary, where I read this text with the sophomores in the Renaissance Literature course. After asking students to read this book, I have to decide how much attention I want to give further discussion to what already feels like the provocative, almost transgressive attention that Spenser gives to despair. It's certainly a prudent question to think about as an instructor, and one I wrestle through each time I talk on it, knowing some of my own students and their struggles in my classroom. So here's how I think about it. Before I decide what to do in any presentation of the visceral and lengthy cave scene in Book 9 of The Faerie Queen, it's incumbent upon me to make sense of what this lingering is doing in the narrative first. If we can better understand what purpose it serves beyond merely causing us to stumble into despair ourselves, I can know better what to do with it. I can help the students, right? So let's practice the art of imaginative honesty and offer the best reasons we can for why Spenser's provocative scene could be reasonable or even good. First of all, for Spenser, despair is not the minor leagues of Christian suffering. It is vicious, it is violent, and it plays for keeps, and it's awful. I'm with him there, 100%. Lord have mercy. So it's reasonable to posit that this scene is Spenser taking despair deadly seriously in at least 3 ways. First, his scene functions like a potentially traumatizing drill. He marches through the rhetoric, all 90 lines, because such a scene draws evil out into the light, where it can be discussed and rebutted and resisted by another, even while Spenser emphatically reminds us that it's almost impossible to refute despair when suffering from it directly in the moment. Secondly, as literature so powerfully does, the scene illustrates. It shows us how ghastly despair is. Despite and juxtaposed with the effusive, heroic-sounding rhetoric, the gruesomeness is like the gruesomeness of the driver's ed videos on drinking behind the wheel. It's supposed to appall us by persuading us that the stakes are this high, so we're careful. Our affections want to run with Una and Red Cross Knight away from despair in the opposite direction. Third, Spenser suggests a non-systematic assessment of how despair operates in suffering minds, hearts, and imaginations. Spenser makes despair a grotesque character, a speaking spectacle with his own persona. In this way, Spenser separates the noxious despair from Red Cross Knight, and separates despair from Terwin, and separates despair from Trevisan as the sufferers. Despair is not them, but his words get inside of them and wound them. Finally, I think we can put Spenser in a category for violence I might call literary substitution, shared with the likes of Flannery O'Connor, not bad company, in a logic that works something like this. A fictional character with a knife in the chest on the page is not a fictional life wasted, particularly if that shock saves a living soul. Unlike 98% of all action movies these days, Spenser's violence is anything but gratuitous. The violence is a dark grace, pleading, warning, not this way, never this way, Spenser's voice is Una's voice. Come away. I offer you their voices, this intense scene, because I want it to be my voice too. Come away. Last Christmas, poet and Christian essayist Christian Wyman published Zero at the Bone, 50 Entries Against Despair. The title of my own talk tonight is an engagement with Wyman's project, insofar as it agrees that there are, thanks be to God, countermeasures against despair, and that Christian literature offers a substantive way and means to push back against it. If Wyman offers a composite of 50 entries, cumulatively seeking to bolster up our hearts against despair, tonight, Edmund Spenser and John Bunyan have offered us dialogues against despair, and I mean this literally. They have offered us a series of literal dialogues with two characters, one named Despair, and the dialogues dialogues with two characters, one named Despair, and dialogues to counter-persuade against despair. Talking with despair in Spenser and Bunyan looks fairly similar. The despair headspace we see in them tends to be dialogic, two-voiced, and in the most substantive moments of despair as a personified character is one of them. The personification and resulting dialogue is less of a surprise in Bunyan's allegory, where faithful, hopeful, and just about everything else runs around as a costumed character complete with a 17th century pilgrim-shaped hat. But in Spenser, it's just the same, the voice of ragged-haired despair huddling in his cave. In both authors, this conversation with despair ends up tending toward the conversive. It is a converso, with a turning, literally. Despair is a profoundly persuasive false truth character, and he is seemingly impossible to counter-persuade directly, or impossible for the sufferer to counter-persuade by direct engagement. This conversion, or movement from one position to another, so embedded in the very idea of conversation, movement from one speaker to another, goes, in despair sequences, in only one direction, movement or turning the main character towards and into despair's position. The way out in Bunyan and Spenser's sufferers, then, is to introduce a second conversation to outcompete the internal dialogue with despair. Red Cross Knight needs Una to speak to him and to rip that knife out of his hand. Christian needs Hopeful to remind him of the promises he cannot call to mind. And the man in the iron cage? Well, the man in the iron cage remains a tragedy to us, not merely because he is there, but because he's there alone, and so we expect will remain there. It may be devastatingly true that one suffering from despair will find it impossible to shut despair up directly, but it is simultaneously wonderfully true that the words of others can help turn us from despair. What we learn in these two early modern depictions of despair is that the sufferer is still movable or persuadable. The one who suffers can turn. This, of course, is a great liability. No, dang nabbit, don't give in to despair. And simultaneously a great hope. Yes, that's right. Listen to me. Lord have mercy. These two texts also agree about the extrinsic nature of hope. The force to turn away from despair comes from outside the sufferer, and thus perseverance and hope requires more than just the self. Others are a necessary gift to the despairing. These two details, one suffering from despair can yet be moved, but won't be moved alone, concretizes some coherent conclusions about the way these texts position themselves to help their contemporary readers. Like basic street smarts, Bunyan and Spenser offer their readers soul smarts. Don't take on the voice of despair alone, or, stated positively, bring others into your life and avail yourself of their counsel. Conversations with despair draw us into despair. Conversations with others might yet draw us out. We have only a little time to answer the three shrewd objections that Lady Una raises to the recommendation to let others in when King Arthur asks her to share with him what might be distressing her. Oh, quoth she, great grief will not be told and can more easily be thought than said. In other words, Una says, suffering is hard to put in words. Yes, Arthur agrees, it is hard work. And he doesn't take it for granted, but it is good work, and it can be done, quote, by will aiding might. So, Una objects again. But grief, quoth she, grows greater displayed, and if it then find not help, breeds despair. In other words, Arthur, if I tell you my sorrows and you can't help, it'll get worse, and then I, who am holding on together by one little thread, will despair. So, Arthur reminds her patiently that they're not alone in working through her grief. They hold fast to faith. But flesh may pair, she returns. Yes, he agrees, the body may impair, but the soul can, quote, repair. Una's objections are good and reasonable. One should use care in opening up grief or despairing, since it's tolling on you to do so, since bearing one's soul to another who cannot help might accelerate despair, and since our bodies and minds and souls are interconnected and impact one another. And this debate about soul care is witty and wise. It's one of my favorite literary scenes. But what Arthur persuades us and Una in this dialogue is that he is a good confidant for her trouble. The real risks that Una names do not mean that one should not share at all, therefore. By no means. Rather, Una's objections underscore the discernment that's needed in choosing a companion and seeking counsel. So, the texts tonight themselves function as a helpful model in this regard. What is the relationship of the Fairy Queen to the reader, or Pilgrim's Progress to the reader? Bunyan is explicit in his note to his readers. He is adamantly self-conscious of them and self-conscious of his book as a companion to them. If Christian has a faithful for the middle of his journey, and if Christian has a hopeful for the latter third of his journey, then Bunyan's readers have Bunyan's Christian as their companion. Christian is a friend, recommending reader encouragement and hope and counsel and counter-persuasion against despair's lies. Christian exists for the reader. It is Bunyan making use of every available means of persuasion for you. Bunyan calls each invention in his allegory burrs to get stuck in your brain. Those are his terms. Brain burrs to go with you everywhere you go and to get into your memory so you can call them to mind even when you don't have Bunyan in your hand. Though everything the students will tell you we learn about the classical canon is that somebody's always got a classic copy of something in their backpack at all times. So this could be a survival technique, right? When you pack your backpack. It is no doubt an old, worn-out cliche by now, but for our two early modern authors, books are companions in two senses. The Aristotelian sense popularized by C.S. Lewis, as a friend in pursuit of the same end. You too? I thought I was the only one. This camaraderie is true for suffering as well. You too, Bunyan? You re-encounter despond again and again and again, all the way to Jesus' arms. And Christian, you too, again in the slough, again in the valley of the shadow of death, again in the castle, again in the river of death to the very end of life itself. I thought I was the only one. Literary companionship is a gift in the fight against despair because it reminds us that while our sufferings may be particular, Christian's experiences are his, unique to his trip along the way. But they're also common. Both can be true at the same time. It is no small comfort to the reader to find another text side by side, especially in the case of despair, as a student recently reminded me, because despair isolates. Books are also a companion of the reader in offering aid and help, as in the book of Ecclesiastes. If one falls into the ditch, a friend, metaphorically or literally, pulls you out. No, not that way, this way, right? Spenser is more articulate about the role of his literature playing in this moral or spiritual formation. He wants his readers to receive the project of the Fairy Queen as a delightful teacher towards, in his words, quote, making a man of virtue. Hopeful and Una offer readers conversational models that they might borrow to draw a friend from the evils of despair's persuasion. Shakespeare's friends are really adamant about this. John Hemmings and Henry Condell, contemporaries of Spenser, who edited Shakespeare's first folio, were emphatic about the transitional role that a literary work plays in serving as a companion and counselor to helping the reader become a companion and counselor to another. Read Shakespeare in this case, therefore, again and again. And if you do not like him, surely you are in some manifest danger not to understand him. And so we leave you others of his friends, the plays, whom, if you need, can be your guides. And if you need them not, you can lead yourself and others, as such readers we wish him. Well, I subtitled this lecture, Spenser and Bunyan on Literary Perseverance. I wish to call attention to the ways that both employ narrative to serve the faith of others. Bunyan and Spenser offer their readers literary companions and literary mentors as a means of helping others to persevere in the faith, to persevere in hope in God. Thank you. And I know Leah is so good at making sure we end timely, so we can open the floor for questions. I'm glad to take us in any way.
You don't have a roving microphone tonight. So
Okay.
if you be assertive in expressing your questions.
And I'll repeat them in
you
the
repeat
microphone.
them. But maybe I'll get us started.
Okay.
Do you consider that there is a view of melancholy and despair here with Bunyan and Spenser as Renaissance early moderns compared to medieval ancients? And like, what are they either expanding on or giving us that's novel in their view?
Yeah, that's good. So this is Rick's question is one of historical development. How is a medieval imagination of despair going to be different than a Renaissance and early modern understanding? I think we could probably just go back to the title of Timothy Bright's work as well as the title of Burton, so contemporaries of both Bunyan and Spenser. The number of things that they're trying to do in the number of categories. So the transition from medicine to doctor to philosopher, the early modern imagination is moving into developing a science for this, right? So they're watching how the body is responding, early experimental science, right? It's very early in kind of the development of what we would say like experiment-based science. But the growth and development is, well, we know he has a soul, but he also has a body. How can these things work more closely together? How can we trace the interactions from one to the other? I would say a medieval imagination is working largely in categories that tend not to mingle as much experimental science with kind of philosophical positions held. So we could say, oh, a medieval imagination imagines the man in three parts: the mind, the thumos, the courage, the soul, and the body. And how are these, or the appetites, how do these work together from a Platonic understanding, Aristotelian understanding? So I would say there's development in the direction of experimental science in the early modern period in particular. Yeah, but still, I mean, I don't want to overemphasize. The early moderns are still borrowing really heavily from Galen. So Galen is a Greek doctor. He's going to rule through the Middle Ages, and he's going to rule into the early modern period. So Bright and Burton are going to cite him liberally and not just to disagree with him. So there's still a strong sense of received both medicinal and philosophic tradition. I think what we see in Burton's title and Bright's title is like, we're going to try to put it all together. We're going to try to account in a kind of comprehensive way for science and philosophy and theology and. So a desire to hold it all together. Good. Other questions? Yeah, Jorge.
So going off of Professor Siegel's question, when you talked about the scene in the River of Death,
Mm-hmm.
you quoted how hopeful tells Christians to take hope, take courage.
Uh-huh.
And then later, in Doubting Castle, hopeful encourages Christian the way, and he reminds him of all those courageous scenes that were fighting
Apollyon.
And so I guess my question is, how would you connect the cardinal virtue of courage with the theological virtue of hope? Like, how do these really, because like, even when Red Cross walks into the cave of despair, that's really very rash.
Yeah, good.
Extreme courage.
Yeah, sure.
How would you relate those two virtues?
Yeah, good. So the question is, how do we relate the virtue of courage to hope, the theological virtue? I think you are well on your way, Jorge, to answering the question insofar as courage is understood as a mean between two extremes. There is, however, so the cardinal virtues, courage, prudence, justice. What am I missing? Thank you, temperance. Oh, it's book 2 of the Fairy Queen, temperance. Right, so these 4, you can have an extreme and you can have a deficiency. You can have too much or you can have too little. The theological virtues don't seem to work in the same way with this deficiency and excess. So when you ask we could run the question, how does hope serve courage? Well, hope would moderate courage. That's the role that hope is going to play. this way, Christian, and oh, nothing like, he's going to help as I think, a moderating effort. That's certainly what Lady Una is doing the whole time with Red Cross Knight. Red Cross Knight is too much courage, and so she is constantly trying to ask kind of prudential, mediating, mean questions. Can we keep it in the middle? Maybe, and maybe not run in there without your spear. Did you want your spear? Right, that's Canto 2. And so I think the theological virtues to which there is no mean tend to play the kind of mean role, staying in the center, not too much, too little, in the cardinal virtues. I think that would be the first thing I would say. Thanks. Yeah, Christina.
So I'm thinking about that idea of the other voice.
Uh-huh.
And there is some autobiographical material.
That's right.
So does he ever talk about the other voice in his life?
Others who, yes, good. So he doesn't speak into, in his own, oh yes, sorry. So the question is, Bunyan speaks autobiographically about the temptation to despair in his Grace Abounding to Chief of Sinners, I believe is the title of his autobiography. And Christina asked, does Bunyan talk this way about two-voicedness in his own life? I think he does not, that I recall, speak of despair in any kind of second voice. I think, as for both Spenser and Bunyan, when we read, or when we were to ask them, so what is despair like in the real world? It's an internal dialogue, right? None of them are going to say, like, there goes despair running around, right? This is allegorical. And so that second voicedness is the second voice inside your head for Bunyan. So I don't know that he speaks explicitly of a second voice, but he will certainly describe the words that he's hearing in his head or the kind of discouragement. As for encouragement, if I'm remembering from the scenes of Grace Abounding, most of the encouragement that he's talking about are things that he is reading, or the encouragement of others can come from a friend, from sermon, and for Bunyan in particular in his own life, it's very accumulative. It accretes very slowly. He has to hear it again and again and again and again and again until he reaches a kind of stasis in which he believes he is indeed saved. But it goes on for his whole life, this kind of return to despond. And so the repeated counsel, like how many times do you, what's the transfer point from this much encouragement and this much exhortation in the word to bearing up? Like 70 times 7? I don't know, a lot proportionately. So I think this is true for Christian and hopeful. Christian needs a lot more encouragement from hopeful. It's not a one-to-one. I said once, peace be to you, and then we did fine. He records again and again, like an accumulation of encouragement. Yeah, good. Yes?
So Bunyan's work has been described as the most popular allegory of all time. It's been described as the most popular selling book beyond the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Here we are talking about it 300 some years later. We're dissecting it and talking about it. There's been an enduring encouragement and a strong tradition among families to read this together. It's been a tremendous source of hope and power, scriptural references. What would be so appealing, I'm assuming for myself and others, the Spenser work is not as familiar. What would be the enduring power or the attraction of the Bunyan work compared to Spenser?
Good. So the question is, wow, Bunyan's sure popular. I've never heard about Spenser. Why is Bunyan so enduring? This is a great question, and there's lots of things. Whenever we ask, why does a work endure, we're asking a bigger question about canonicity. How does something get read again and again? And the answers to why something gets read are complicated. Sometimes it's because of the position something takes, a really compelling way to understand something. Sometimes something endures because it's really provocative and wrong, and so people write about it for a very long time, right? Sometimes something endures because of the providence, the accidents of what books didn't get burned, what books did get republished, who got the publication in, how did it get circulated. I mean, Bunyan is happening at a time when we're about to, cross the Atlantic, and we're going to have colonies on both sides. So it's a moment of a lot of global expansion. This influences how popular Bunyan it goes. He gets across the Atlantic faster just because of the moment in time. So if we were to trace why all the factors that Bunyan is so popular, we could go on, and we would probably have many literary debates on Bunyan is so popular because of these reasons or these. But I would say Bunyan sticks like a burr in the imagination because of the almost novel-like quality, these It is an allegory, so people walk around with names like Mr. Worldly Wise Man and Despair, right? Their name is right on their name, their persona is right on their name tag, and yet it feels very, very relatable. That works as a brain burr. Now, Spenser makes a different bet at the end of the 16th century in the 1590s, and he guesses that what's really going to endure, what people really love to cozy up with at night, is some chivalric romance. And he's not wrong for his own day. The chivalric romance, which is a medieval genre, has had a really long enduring history. It's endured through the end of the Middle Ages, into the Renaissance, through the Renaissance to the end, the early modern period. And so Spenser bets stories of King Arthur, it's like Marvel or Star Wars. You tell them that, they're going to put it on replay. And perhaps because King Arthur doesn't end up being the hottest thing into the 17th century, perhaps it's the fact that England has big troubles of its own at the end of the Reformation, massive civil wars. I don't know, chivalric romance is out and the novel is coming in, right? So we're in a moment of literary transition. That could be one reason. Another reason could just be because the poetic stanza is harder to read and understand. Anybody can sit down, your kids can read Bunyan, and the language would be a little strange, but they get it. They get it. Dangerous Journey is a close adaptation, and it's very accessible. Spenser's a lot harder. It wants help. The language is foreign, and particularly whenever you start taking a sentence and flipping all the words in the order, comprehension is difficult. So I think that would help explain the difficulty of the form, helps explain why something's so popular, which, I mean, tells us something about, hey, writing theological work in popular form. There's a good reason for that. It circulates. Circulation is good if you're trying to encourage people. So I think, there can be a temptation to like, I will write in a very elevated style. Well, there's good for that. And there's also good for, well, maybe get your argument through. That would be good. That'd be good too. Make it memorable. Brain burrs. Good. Yeah, Katie.
So if you're wanting to approach Spenser from someone who's never read it,
Yeah, good.
would there be retellings that you would recommend to start with or something like that?
Yeah, good. I mean, there's a impulse in me that says dive right in and just get a good edition with good footnotes. There are some really, so here's my recommendation on the footnotes. Don't get endnotes that explain, because that is ridiculous, and you're going to spend your whole time flipping to the end of the book, and you'll get paper cuts, right? Just get good footnotes, which means your editor is going to gloss at the bottom of the page, so your eyes just do this little jumping activity, and it doesn't break attention, or even better, sometimes you can get them to gloss right down the side. So Eric Gray has a lovely edited, he's the editor of, I'm not remembering the publisher at the minute, but Eric Gray does a great job editing book 2. I think Carol Kask is the editor of book 1. They're just really accessible insofar as they're easy to use, the words are glossed, you can use them. There was a high school edition done, or the audience was high school, out of Canon Press, in which Roy Maynard and Toby Sumter, I believe, are the two editors. And their footnotes are very helpful in understanding, but they're also designed to keep 7th grade or maybe 9th grade boys entertained. So when you get like the catalog of trees, you get this lovely little footnote about like, and ash is really good for baseball too, which if that drives you nuts, you might not appreciate it very much. If that helps you, great. These are extrinsic to the text, right? Are they aids? Do they help you stay in? Do they take your attention away? Maybe one thing to note about Bunyan, if we're talking about footnotes, Bunyan has a very odd way of framing his help. So we already have an allegory, which is weird. And inside this allegory, there's a dreamer. It's a frame narrative. So there's a dreamer who dreams, and he writes this allegory. And then, if that's not enough, he puts these margin notes everywhere through his text, and they are his. Some of them are scriptural passages telling you, go from my text to another text, right? They are pushing you out of the text into another text. Sometimes they're explanatory. Sometimes they're sarcastic. Talkative gets excoriated by the marginal voice, right? Oh, talkative. Oh, brave. Talkative is the famous example. The margin notes are telling you this, right? I love your margin notes. So these early modern texts, you can get a modern edition that ciphers, or some of these early modern texts are starting to play around with the features that we take so much for granted in a modern codex or a book, things like marginalia. Bunyan loves this. I can get yet another interpretive voice on top of the dreamer, on top of the allegory, on top of the interpreter, the margins and the footnotes. Indices are really fun to read in early modern works as well. It's like a new technology. We can organize by index. So these books in and of themselves kind of get the real thing and play around with it. It's never a bad thing to have two side by side. Or my favorite recommendation, especially for early modern lit, it is modern literature, right? It's English in modern English, but it can be hard to understand. Your ears are gonna pick up way faster than your eyes because spelling isn't standardized. So you pop your earbuds in and gling, turn the page, right? If you follow along with your ears, it will be far more intelligible. So I would recommend get yourself a good edition for your eyes and then let your ears do a lot of the work. It will help, especially with poetry, because you just keep the lines running. You just got to keep moving, keep moving. Yeah, good question. Yeah, thanks.